Canadian Prohibition. Although not as well known as American Prohibition, Canadian Prohibition was also put into place briefly and existed around the same time as its southern counterpart. Any questions I used? I used the following questions when researching my intended topic. Where was Prohibition passed and repealed? How did American Prohibition affect Canadian Prohibition and vice versa? What movements were involved in the Prohibition movements? How people got around the Prohibition laws? Who is the most famous smuggler in Canada? Is Prohibition still in place in any provinces today? Why Prohibition never seems to work? Who benefited from Prohibition? Why was Prohibition implemented? And what was moonshining and why was it dangerous? Why was Prohibition implemented to begin with? Prohibition was implemented in Canada and America due to a rising concern regarding destructive drinking culture in North America. Many people were concerned about the amount of men going to taverns or saloons, using all their money to buy liquor and coming home either in a violent rage or so drunk they could barely function. Alcohol abuse was directly linked with a massive amount of domestic violence at the time, including abuse against women and children, and brawls being commonplace in the streets or drinking establishments. When and where it was passed and repealed. Prohibition in Canada and America was enforced similarly but differed in the time periods they were introduced. While American Prohibition was introduced in 1918, initially as a war measure, Canadian Prohibition had already been in practice since 1901. That was 13 years before the First World War. The Canadian Temperance Act, or Scots Act of 1878, gave local governments the local option to ban the sale, manufacture, and consumption of alcohol. And while Prohibition in the United States was repealed in 1933, Canadian Prohibition was repealed progressively throughout the 1920s. The Ontario Temperance Act, as an example, lasted until 1927, where it was finally repealed. Other provinces held on for far longer. PEI, or Prince Edward Island, held on to its Prohibition Act until 1948. Quebec voted overwhelmingly to not have prohibition in place, making it a large exception to the rest of Canada's provinces at the time. Temperance movements. The first Canadian temperance movement was formed in May 24, 1874. Their goals were primarily to stop the mounting issues regarding alcoholism in North America. However, they were also involved in certain other movements such as suffrage and women's rights. The Canadian temperance movement was mostly dominated by women with Protestant views and women concerned about abusive husbands coming home drunk and either beating them, their children, or simply having no money left from their time at the saloon. Although America had its own women's temperance movement, the WCTU or Women's Christian Temperance Movement, the movement primarily responsible for the actual implementation of prohibition was the Anti Saloon League or ASL. ASL, Anti Saloon League, and propaganda. America's women's temperance movement played a large part in introducing prohibition to America. However, it was greatly overshadowed by the Anti Saloon League, a political lobbying group. There was no ASL equivalent in Canada, however, in America it held far more influence than the women's temperance movement. The ASL achieved most of its power by trying to convince sitting government officials to support prohibition or getting their own candidates elected into their place. They also printed large amounts of propaganda in order to push their message that America was facing a serious problem when it came to alcohol. Similar propaganda was also pushed in Canada by its respective temperance groups, example of which can be seen below. How it was enforced and profited from. Canadian prohibition was left up to the individual provinces to enforce and never became a nationwide law in the same way as the American version. American prohibition was enforced as a full amendment to their constitution, specifically the 18th Amendment, whereas in Canada, movements for temperance were unable to bring about such a radical idea as a federal nationwide prohibition law. Temperance laws varied from province to province. In some provinces, it was okay to sell and produce some wines, and in others, virtually all alcoholic drinks were totally banned, regardless of percentage. Some provinces banned the consumption of alcohol altogether, whereas some others didn't go so far, stopping at banning production and distribution. This created an added difficulty for enforcement, as a rum runner could simply go to one province, obtain the booze he was running legally, then sell it in another province for higher amounts. Worse for the police, once that runner entered another province, they were subject to its laws. Canadian prohibition officers made great efforts to combat prohibition in Canada and attempt to enforce the law. However, much like the United States, the inherent unpopularity of prohibition made doing so a very difficult task. People would often not cooperate with investigations or might hide illegal booze. Some also felt conflicted at the idea of arresting their own family over such an unpopular law. How some people bent the law. Although liquor was mostly illegal in provinces such as Ontario, Prince Edward Island, and other provinces, people began to find ways around prohibition being enforced. For example, before Prohibition could issue alcohol as a prescription to people who needed it. However, with the introduction of Prohibition, many of them realized they could make extra money by prescribing it to people who wanted to have something to drink. There was also an interesting consumer good introduced into the American market, which went mostly unnoticed by the American government. That product was Vine GLO, or Vine Glow, a brick of dehydrated grape juice. By itself, the product wasn't alcoholic, however, the label had a suspicious notice that basically said not to dissolve the brick in water and leave it alone for 20 days, because it would turn to wine. Vine Glow was never sold in Canada, only in the United States. Sacramental wines were also allowed under Prohibition, which meant religious figures could make money by selling the wine illegally after Mass. Moonshining. Although the production of alcohol was illegal in many Canadian provinces under Prohibition, that doesn't mean people didn't try to make their own. This process is generally referred to as moonshining, and it became far more prevalent under Prohibition. However, moonshining could be dangerous work, both for the moonshiner and the person drinking the moonshine itself. On some occasions, moonshine liquor could be poisonous due to the ingredients involved. Symptoms of moonshine poisoning could range from blindness to lead poisoning, leading possibly to death. As for the moonshiners, the distillation process creates alcohol fumes, which can be very flammable. If ignited, it could have caused the illegal still to explode, especially if kept inside. Because of this, stills had to be kept outside of houses, where they might be easier to spot by law enforcement or neighbors. Despite all the dangers, though, many Americans and Canadians made attempts at moonshining in Prohibition, all in the hope that doing so might lead to either huge profits or, for the drinkers, a relief from Prohibition. And for some it did. As for others, it ended in a fiery explosion or death/blindness from poorly made moonshine. In my case, I chose Rocco Perry, an infamous smuggler of the 1920s, as the influential Canadian I wish to study. Rocco Perry was an infamous Prohibition era Canadian mafia boss who smuggled illegal alcohol from Canada into American states on the country's southern border. At the time of Prohibition, he became known as the most prominent gangster in Canada. He would also earn the title of the King of Bootleggers. He was very popular among the Canadian people despite being a well known criminal. He was quoted as saying, "I have the right to violate the law if I can get away with it. Men do it in what you call legitimate business until they get caught. I shall do it in my business until I get caught. Am I a criminal because I violate a law that people do not want?" I find this quote very poignant, as Prohibition was very unpopular amongst both Americans and Canadians. Many bootleggers justify their crimes using the defense that because most people don't care about the law, why should I? Rocco Perry is believed to have died shortly after the end of World War II, and it's assumed that he was put inside a barrel of cement before being thrown into Hamilton Bay to drown. However, the truth of the matter is still very obscure. Speakeasies. Speakeasies were an illegal saloon or bar that could be disguised as legitimate businesses or households, and became extremely popular during the days of Prohibition. In fact, during the era of Prohibition for both America and Canada, the amount of drinking establishments, illegal or legitimate, nearly doubled. Speakeasies became social refuges for people of all kinds of social class. You could find everyone from the most prestigious rich to the most underprivileged workers. They also did not discriminate as heavily based on race or other social differences, something that in the 1920s was rare. The term speakeasy comes from the fact that people inside them were supposed to practice speaking softly so as to not draw attention from the police or neighboring buildings and rooms. Some speakeasies were operated by gangsters and crime syndicates, and even when they were broken up by federal police, more would simply rise in their place. How Prohibition continues to this day. Believe it or not, but Prohibition actually continues to be practiced to this day in some towns in the young northern province of Nunavut. Unfortunately, as of 2015, Nunavut has been host to an incredibly high suicide and crime rate, with crime rates at nearly 10 times the national average, and homicide and suicide rates 10 times higher than anywhere else in Canada. Many of the people living in the province attribute these problems to alcohol consumption. Apparently, in some parts of the province, 95% of police calls pertain to alcohol. Bootlegging is still a common occurrence in certain towns in Nunavut, and just like in the 1920s, it's a lucrative business venture. A bottle of wine purchased in one town for $65 to $90 Canadian can be sold in another for as much as $650 Canadian. Personally, I believe that the drinking issue in Nunavut has to do with cultural maladjustment. The province of Nunavut hasn't existed for very long, and most of the people living in the province before were nomadic aboriginals. As soon as Nunavut was incorporated into the Union, the Aboriginal population needed to suddenly transition from a nomadic lifestyle to one more reminiscent of the modern suburban and sedimentary lifestyle we see nowadays. Because of their previous status, proper drinking culture didn't exist in these Aboriginal cultures, and this in turn caused many Aboriginal people to develop addictions very quickly. Why prohibition doesn't work. Time and time again, we've seen governments try to ban addictive substances like alcohol and recreational drugs, but each and every time it's failed. Why is that the case? I'm certain we can trace this policy malfunctions to the simple fact that when people want something, they will make every effort to get it, illegal or otherwise. In addition to this problem, the banning of an illicit substance can become economically unpopular. This is because when properly regulated and controlled by the government, illicit substances can be taxed, providing a source of income to the country. So, like with marijuana, the answer to the problem of alcohol abuse appears to be regulation and education. In other words, regulate the substance so that crime does not rise, and slowly educate the population on the bad effects of the substance so that its use lowers over time. My thoughts on this topic. Prohibition in Canada was an ill fated attempt to try and control what was an increasingly out of control drinking epidemic. However, what actually ended up happening was crime began to grow out of control and people's drinking habits got even worse. Addictive substances seem to not be an exception, but rather a normality of everyday life. Thus, government should deal with them appropriately by controlling their distribution and sale, and by educating the potential users on their physical and mental effects. I also think that attempting prohibition or the ban of any recreational substance under any circumstances is a lost cause. Trying to ban people from either buying or doing something they want is virtually impossible. Regardless of what measures are being used, if people want something, they will get it. And if that process happens to be illegal, eh, if that process happens to be legal, is generally seen as irrelevant. First part of my big bibliography. Second part, and the end. Thank you for listening and reading this presentation.